Well, welcome back, everyone, to our study in the story of Jesus. And I wanted to say that although this is our final session, those of you that are up to speed know that this is the week before Christmas. I imagine that some of you, as you're catching up, won't actually get to this session until after Christmas, but I wanted to just say Merry Christmas to all of you, and I'll probably send out an email wishing you the same anyway. I also wanted to say that, first of all, thank you to those of you that sent a gift to support Telos Project during National Giving Day. I think I missed Colorado Gives. I think I got some things backwards, but I also just wanted to say I know that many of you are contemplating your year-end giving, and I want to encourage you. It would be helpful to send a gift in support of the Telos Project, and I might send out an email right the week before the end of the year to remind people of that also, but it's helpful. And for those of you that are watching this during the week before Christmas, I thought I might also send out, along with maybe a Merry Christmas email, a link to the session we did on the Nativity, because it could be fun to go back and kind of see some of what we talked about and compare that to what you normally associate with the birth of Jesus. So we'll try and cover all the bases, even though we're doing, I guess we're doing Easter at Christmas time today. The other thing I wanted to say is that, we've hit a lot of the highlights of the life of Jesus, but we have really just scratched the surface. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. And my encouragement to you, now this is, you've had a kind of an overview of putting together some of the highlights and how things fit together in Jesus' life, but I'd really like to encourage you, just go back and read the Gospels, because again, there's so much great material that we haven't hit in these weeks together, and I think that, again, that would just, you would be blessed if you did it. So I also just wanted to say it's interesting coming to this point in the life of Christ at Christmas time. I had a nice note from Phil Harris, a friend from Holdridge, Nebraska, who was looking at the image of the crucifixion that went out with the email, and was just contrasting how it's important when we celebrate the nativity of Jesus, and there's, I think it's a very sweet time of year, and the way we look at things and remember his birth, that we also have to remember that ultimately this was a baby that was born to die, and that the juxtaposition of the crucifixion with the nativity reminds us of that. So I thank Phil for that observation that he made. Last session, you might remember we talked about the crucifixion of Jesus, and I made reference to it as one of the two greatest events in human history, particularly not simply the physical crucifixion, but what happened spiritually on the cross as Jesus took on our sin for us and became our substitute. And then intentionally, we ended kind of on a sober note and just went to black as Jesus died. Today we're going to look at what you might think of as, again, the second of the two greatest events in human history, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I was thinking, by the way, just this morning, again, for those of you that are watching this the week before Christmas, that I think it would be important to point out again, maybe that would be another one of the greatest events in human history, because of course if Jesus had not come as that baby there in Bethlehem, none of the rest of this would have happened. So again, the birth of Christ is one of the greatest events in history. And there's one more yet to come, which is the actual return of Jesus Christ. And for those of you that might not have been with us, I took you through the book of Revelation. I did 30 weeks on that subject, and those videos are available there on YouTube also, where you go to pick up these sessions on the story of Jesus. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go right back to where we left off last week, try to capture a little bit of what that first Easter must have been like. And I'm going to break it up into 10 smaller scenes. So I'll walk you through that, because there are actually ways in which this material breaks up logically, but it's a little bit like, again, like watching a film and jumping from scene to scene. So I'll walk you through all of those. Scene number one, it really has to do with the burial of Jesus on Friday afternoon. So we're told this in John chapter 19. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. You could kind of imagine that it's a beautiful garden there in Jerusalem. It's almost sundown on Friday. The Jewish Sabbath is about to begin. And as we look around the garden, we actually see a tomb that has been carved out of solid rock. Actually, only Matthew's gospel tells us that the tomb was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, who we're going to meet in just a minute here. But as we would look at the tomb, we can see movement inside, and John tells us that this is what is going on at this point. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. Again, as we would get closer and we would see inside the tomb, again, we would see two men dressed inside that would indicate to us that they were wealthy, and we would recognize the one. Well, first of all, we would recognize perhaps that this is Joseph of Arimathea. Again, the text tells us that he was a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin and a secret believer in Jesus. And he had gone to Pilate and received permission to have the body of Jesus. I mean, it's so gutsy what this guy did. Again, it was as if when he did this, he was putting his own life on the line. And of course, it's his garden and it's his tomb where Jesus is going to be buried. We're told, though, that John, and John is the only one of the four Gospels that tell us this, that he was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. And Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. These would have been the spices that were used in a Jewish burial. And so Nicodemus accompanying Joseph of Arimathea there at the tomb. And, here's our Joseph from earlier in our study of the story of Jesus. We're told this: taking the body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen, and this was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. So the body would be wrapped in strips of linen, and in between the different layers of those strips of linen, these spices would be put in there. There are some, by the way, and I can remember Josh McDowell in his book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. His theory was that because some of these spices were moist or were wet, that what would happen is that as they dried, that it would almost form almost like a cocoon with the wrapped linen. We aren't sure about that. I'll make mention of that in just a minute because it ties into the rest of this part of the story. But again, the body of Jesus there has been cleaned. It's been wrapped in linen. It's been layered in spices, and those spices have been laid in between the strips of linen. So we're then told that once that was finished, we might watch as Nicodemus carefully places a final piece of linen over the face of Jesus, and then the two of them leave the tomb. We would watch as this stone that had been crafted to be the covering of the opening of the tomb, the two of them would take this stone and they would roll it. There was usually an angle downward and a trough that stone sat within, and then at the bottom of the trough there would be a restraining stone that would keep that round stone from traveling any further and coming to rest to close off the tomb. And in this particular point, at this particular point in time, when that stone goes into place, we can kind of imagine that the sun goes down and that the Sabbath actually begins. Scene one. Second scene in this part of the story is that the tomb is then guarded. We're told that the next morning, Saturday, which by the way was a Sabbath, which makes it interesting that these Jewish leaders would come to Pilate on the Jewish Sabbath. At the Antonia Fortress, we would see the Roman headquarters again in Jerusalem, the place where Jesus was actually condemned to die. And a small group of priests and Pharisees are gathered waiting for an audience with Pilate, the Roman procurator. We aren't told specifically, but I could almost imagine that this is our Pilate. This is actually Pilate from our series that we did, A.D., The Bible Continues. You can almost, perhaps, guess that the leader of that group might have been Caiaphas. As he comes to Pilate, Pilate probably, we could speculate he's not very happy, and almost in the back of his mind you might be thinking, he's thinking, what now? And we have to go to Matthew's gospel to get the text of what went on in this conversation. And so the Jewish leaders say to Pilate, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" The text doesn't tell us that Pilate says anything, but again, you're just using imagination. You could probably speculate a little bit that Pilate's response would be, "So what? I mean, what do you expect me to do?" And they had gone on to say to him to give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead, and this last deception will be worse than the first. I didn't include this in one of the scenes. I might just point out that When the angels appeared and the tomb was opened and the Roman guard fled, they came into the city to tell the religious leaders, first of all, what had happened, and they were paid then to say exactly what we see these leaders saying to Pilate, that his disciples came and stole the body. We'll see a little bit later why that was extremely improbable. But again, Pilate I can imagine, looks at Caiaphas. He's probably sick of him by this point in time. The last thing he wants is more trouble. So Pilate then, probably turning perhaps to his Praetorian guard, would speak to him, and the text reads like this: take a guard, go make the tomb as secure as you know how. This is the New International Version translation of that text. Literally what the text says is you have a guard, and there's been debate whether or not that statement is Pilate saying, hey, you've got your own guard, go make the tomb as secure. So there are certain scholars that believe that that was not Roman soldiers that were guarding the tomb, but that it was the actual Jewish palace guard. And yet the consensus has always been that what happens here is that Pilate is assigning a guard to go and to make the tomb secure. So again, let's fast forward just a very short time, and what we would see then would be outside the Antonia. We would watch as a group of Roman soldiers head toward the tomb where Nicodemus and Joseph have buried Jesus. A guard, a Roman guard, and oftentimes if you see a picture of this, you might see two soldiers, one standing on either side of the entrance to the tomb. But a Roman guard was a 4 to 16 man security force, each man trained to defend 6 square feet that surrounded him from an entire invading army. And these were the toughest of the tough. And so again, when we get to the tomb, we would see 2 of those soldiers perhaps approach the tomb and begin to put a Roman seal on the tomb, which we're told happens. This is a very well secured tomb, as you can see, and actually usually what a Roman seal consisted of was 2 strips of leather that would cross on either side of whatever was being secured, whether it was a doorway or in this case the covering of a tomb. And then in the center of those leather strips would usually be a Roman seal. And the significance of that is that the breaking of that seal without permission from the Roman authorities, which in this case would have been Pilate, it was punishable by death. This stood for the power and the authority of Rome. And again, to break that seal was extremely serious business. The other offense in terms of guarding a place like this that was punishable by death was if a soldier left their post. And of course, in this particular situation, we know that they were scared, literally terrified of the angels that spoke to them, and all of them fled from the scene, which I'm sure they knew was punishable by death. One of the ways that the Romans punished a soldier that left their post was they would strip them naked and then set them on fire with a fire started with their own clothing. So Roman soldiers did not take this duty lightly. They were very serious. And when they finished sealing the tomb, you can imagine that the ones that had sealed it joined together with the others and began standing guard. And the message at this point was no one is getting in that tomb. Now, we're going to switch over to scene 3 and see what's happening back at the upper room. Again, you have to use a little bit of your imagination, but you can almost think of how the disciples were in a state of shock, probably scared to death at this point in time. Peter, of course, we know, has denied Jesus 3 times. But really, for the disciples, at this point, life as they have known it is over. Not only has Jesus not overthrown the Romans, which many of them believed was the reason that he had come, but he's dead. And because of his crucifixion and his trial and why he was put to death, they're all fugitives. And as his followers, they could all be accused of blasphemy, and they could be crucified. So the tension within that upper room had to be quite remarkable. And really, at this point in time, the story is a tragedy. It's actually a disaster. Jesus is dead, and basically all hope is lost. But everything is about to change, which takes us over to scene 4 and takes us to Sunday morning. We're back at Joseph's garden, and perhaps we see the sun coming up in the east and breaking over the walls of the city, and it is sunrise on Sunday. We see 3 of the women, and I only have 2 in the picture, but we see 3 women making their way through the garden to the side of the tomb. You will notice as you read the Gospels that there are some differences in the way that this is reported. One of the Gospels simply says it was Mary that went to the tomb, but the others identify 3 women: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and then Salome or Joanna being the third of the women. They didn't know that Joseph and Nicodemus had prepared the body for burial. All they knew was they had seen the tomb where the body had been taken to, and now they're coming to prepare Jesus' body for burial. And again, as they're bringing spices, again, a very gutsy move on their part, particularly if you remember or have in the back of your mind that they were susceptible to arrest themselves at this point in time and susceptible to being crucified. So we read this over in Mark, that as they're approaching, I think it's Salome, asks the question, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? These are very optimistic women, at least Mary Magdalene, because again, you have to remember that stone probably weighed anywhere between 1.5 to 2 tons. Remember, it was rolled down a trough to get it to the place where it would cover the entrance to the tomb. And so they're trying to figure out, because how do you get a 1.5 to 2 ton stone rolled back up away from the entrance to the tomb with only 3 women? So let's imagine that as this question is being asked, they sort of break through the place in the garden where the tomb is now visible, and of course they are going to be stunned. John says it this way: early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So they're wondering, not only why is the stone gone, but also what you would notice is the guard is gone, the seal has been broken, the stone has been rolled away. One of the Gospels, I believe it's Mark, in what are called sort of a textual notes. Oftentimes in early manuscripts, little notes would be written in the side margins of the text. And in one of those, it said, again, a stone, that the stone had not only been, it wasn't that it was rolled back up, but the stone had actually been moved some distance. So again, it would have just boggled their imagination what had happened here at the garden tomb. So the guard is gone, again, seal is broken. Something monumental has happened. The women run toward the tomb, and again, Mary Magdalene goes inside, followed by the other woman. And if we could see the look on her face, there might be a kind of a look of confusion because the body is gone, but the grave clothes were still there. He just isn't in them. They're empty. And again, if Josh McDowell is right, what they would have been looking at would have been almost like a cocoon kind of a form there that just didn't have a body in it. The illustration we have simply shows the grave clothes there in the tomb being emptied. And as they're staring at what's going on, we're told that there are suddenly two men standing there beside them. Their clothes are gleaming and radiating light, and of course they are angels. And they speak to the women, and they ask this question: why do you look for the living among the dead? And, Mary maybe still kind of overwhelmed. I imagine her, shaking and looking up at the angels that are speaking. And then they finally say this: he is not here, he has risen. Now, scene number 5, Mary goes back, and she is going back to the upper room. So imagine the door to the upper room bursts open. Everyone in the room is startled, and then Mary reports to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. Now, I can imagine, again, speculating here a little bit, using my imagination, that Peter looks at John, and John looks at Mary, and then back to Peter, and perhaps without even a word, they fly out the door of the upper room and they head toward the tomb. So Peter and John there. Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb, we're told. You can almost imagine them just running through the streets of Jerusalem. Mary Magdalene, at least, if not the other women that were with her, trying to keep up. But they arrive at the tomb. We're told that John gets there first. He was probably the youngest, as you might know, of all the disciples. Many believe that he was just in his teen years, even when he was following Jesus. Peter would have been a little bit older, and so John beats him to the tomb. He sticks his head inside. He doesn't go in. When Peter arrives, Peter goes in, and John comes in and stands by him. And of course, we're told this: then Simon Peter came along behind him, that is, behind John, and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Again, it's not that the tomb is empty, it's that the grave clothes are empty, even possibly undisturbed without Jesus' body. Peter walks up to the head place where head of the place where the body had been laid, picks up that linen cloth that Joseph had put over Jesus' face. It had been neatly folded and laid next to the grave clothes. And we then read this. John writing, when he saw all of this, John said that he saw and believed. He's speaking about himself. So that's why the I is in there. I saw and believed, John is saying. So, speaking of himself, they leave the tomb. They hurry back to the upper room, and it really takes us to scene 6, which has to do with what happens when they leave, and Mary Magdalene stays behind. Again, you can just imagine using your creativity. She's standing outside the tomb. She's confused. Perhaps she's crying. And as she stands there, we see a figure off to her right who speaks to her. And the figure says this, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" And Mary, thinking that it's the gardener, responds, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." And then the figure speaks to her and simply says, "Mary." And Mary now turns. She sees Jesus. She runs to him, falls at her feet, wraps her arms around his leg, and simply says to the risen Christ, Rabboni, again, a Hebrew word that simply means my teacher. Now, let's fast forward a little bit back to the upper room. And imagine this. The doors blow open. Mary stands in the doorway. Every face turns. Every eye is on her. And she's out of breath, but we can see that she is also just thrilled, man. She is over the moon about what has happened. And she reports to them, "I have seen the Lord." So the first appearance of the risen Christ was to Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene goes back to the disciples and reports that she has seen the Lord. And because she's the first one that's actually seen Jesus, and she's the one that goes and reports it back to the disciples, she is sometimes referred to as the apostle to the apostles. So Jesus decides that the first person he's going to reveal himself to is a woman, and it's Mary. And so Mary carries the message now to the apostles. Scene number 7 has to do with the appearance of the risen Christ. Now I picked one incident out of the Gospels to illustrate this, and it has to do what happens with 2 of the disciples that after the message has gone out that somebody has seen the risen Lord. They are on their way to a small town about 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus. This is only contained in Luke. The 2 are identified as Simon and Cleopas, and if you can imagine them walking down the road, engaged in a conversation, and again headed to the village of Emmaus. Now, they're talking as they walk, and as they're walking, a third man approaches them and joins them. If we were looking at the scene, we would see Jesus. Now, they see a man, but the text tells us that they are kept from seeing it is Jesus. As a matter of fact, I believe the words that it's used is that he appeared to them in a different form. And so whether it was that they were their vision was impacted in such a way that they saw someone, a form different from Jesus, or whether in fact Jesus had taken on some kind of different form, the reality is they don't know who this is. And so as he approaches them, he speaks to them. "What are you talking about?" he asks. They stop. I can imagine, we can see that they are upset, and one of them speaks to Jesus. Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And I love Jesus' response to them. What things? And he's kind of, I think he's kind of playing with them a little bit, because obviously he knows what they're talking about. And he's kind of playing perhaps a little prank on them. That's just a personal, opinion. But we read this. They reply to him about Jesus of Nazareth. And then the text goes on, and Cleopas says to them, to Jesus, actually, he was a powerful prophet, strong in word and deed, and the chief priests and our rulers handed him over and crucified him. And Simon, then perhaps responding or adding to what Cleopas has said, says, we've hoped he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. They had still this image of Messiah as a political deliverer that would remove Rome, and that the kingdom of Israel would be restored to the place it had during the time of David and Solomon. But again, Cleopas says that this is the third day, and some of our women went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They said they had a vision of angels that told them he was still alive. Jesus responds to them and asks them the question, didn't the prophets say the Messiah had to suffer these things? They begin to walk again now. Jesus is talking to them. We jump to inside of a small inn. Simon and Cleopas and Jesus are sitting at a table with bread and wine in front of them, and Jesus reaches out, takes the bread, he holds it up and gives thanks, and we're told that as he breaks it and gives some to each of them, we probably would see their eyes get as big as saucers, because whatever God did to keep them from recognizing Jesus, it's lifted. They see it's Jesus, and instantly he disappears. Then we go back to the upper room, because that's where they head, immediately to the upper room. You can imagine the door bursts open. The atmosphere inside the upper room at this point is probably a lot more upbeat, because at least they know that the tomb is empty, and Mary is saying, I've seen the risen Lord. But still probably a lot of confusion. Mary has seen Jesus. The others have only seen empty grave clothes and an empty tomb. But now the two men from the road to Emmaus, Simon and Cleopas, they charge into the room, and their message is quite simple. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, and there they found the 11, and those with them assembled together. And here's their message. It's true, the Lord has risen. And just as he says that, Jesus himself is standing in the room. And so we read this. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them. And this takes us into what I would think of as the 8th scene in this whole period, this whole incident, and that is that Jesus now appears himself to the disciples. All the disciples are there, we're told, except Thomas, and Jesus, the risen Christ, speaks to them and simply says, "Peace be with you." Some of them are terrified. Some think he's a ghost. And so Jesus holds out his hands, and we see the wounds, and he says to them, "Look at my hands and my feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And still, just as they are, gobsmacked, and Jesus, you can imagine, kind of looking around at them, and I imagine he maybe gets a little smile on his face, and then he says to them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" Now, we're going to flash forward a little bit to later that night in the upper room, and in scene 9, we're going to look at the encounter with Jesus and Thomas. So Thomas, and this is Thomas from the Bible series, Thomas, again, was not there. Thomas hasn't seen what they have seen. But imagine that the door opens and Thomas comes in, and we read this, that the other disciples say to him, "Thomas, we have seen the Lord." And, again, I imagine that the whole room breaks out in noise as everyone is talking excitedly at once and telling Thomas what has happened. And then you can almost imagine Thomas holds up his hand to quiet them. He's doubtful. He's not buying it. This is why he's called Doubting Thomas, of course. And he says to the disciples, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now, the text tells us that it's a whole week later, and you have a very similar scenario. The apostles are in the upper room. Thomas is present this time, and we read this. Jesus appears. He reaches out his upturned hand to Thomas. I guess that's what we saw back here in this other slide. Okay, and he says 3 things to him. First of all, he says, "Put your finger here." Secondly, he says, "Put your hand in my side." And finally, he says, "Stop doubting and believe." And when he speaks these words to Thomas, and Thomas now sees the risen Christ, Thomas, I believe, drops to his knees and makes his confession, "My Lord and my God." Then finally, scene 10, and I'm just going to kind of hit a couple of highlights after the resurrection, other appearances, that Jesus makes. And so over the next 40 days, Luke tells us that Jesus will appear repeatedly in the book of Acts. In the first chapter, Luke says that those appearances are with many convincing truths to convince people that he has actually risen from the dead. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul is speaking about the resurrection, he says that at a point in time that Jesus actually appears to over 500 people. And then on the 40th day, in the presence of the disciples, Jesus actually will ascend, vanish from their sight, also in Acts chapter 1. And then 10 days later, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit will be poured out on the 120 believers that have gathered in the upper room, and radical transformations take place. The church is born. And actually, with the day of Pentecost, the story doesn't really end. The resurrection is not the end. The resurrection is really the beginning, but that's another story. So thank you for hanging with me during these weeks. Again, I really encourage you to go back and read the Gospels. We've scratched the surface, but we've hit some of the highlights, and hopefully that has been helpful. And we'll keep you posted on what's coming next.